Picture this. It's 1608. The heart of Rome, the Vatican. And walking through those sacred halls, past marble statues and Renaissance paintings, is a black African man dressed in silk robes embroidered with gold thread. He's not a servant. He's not a slave. He's an ambassador, a diplomat, sent by a king. And he's about to meet the Pope as an equal. His name was Dom Antonio Manuel, and his very existence in that room shattered everything Europe wanted to believe about Africa. But here's the thing that'll really blow your mind. This wasn't a one-time event. For nearly 200 years, black African ambassadors walked into European courts, negotiated treaties, dined with royalty, and proved that the savage Africa narrative was a complete lie. And then, history erased them. Until now. Let's rewind to understand how impossible this should have been. We're talking about the late 1400s to the 1600s. This is the era when Europe is beginning the Atlantic slave trade. Ships are being built specifically to transport human cargo. The machinery of one of history's greatest atrocities is being assembled piece by piece. And to make that system work, to make it morally acceptable to Christians who claim to follow a gospel of love, Europe needed a story. They needed Africans to be something less than human, savage, primitive, without civilization, without culture, without souls worth saving, unless it was through the barrel of a gun or the hold of a slave ship. But while Europe was constructing this narrative, something extraordinary existed just south of the equator that completely contradicted everything they were trying to sell. The Kingdom of Congo, sprawling across what is now northern Angola, the Western Democratic Republic of Congo, and parts of the Republic of Congo. This wasn't some small tribal territory. We're talking about an empire of 2 to 3 million people. They had a sophisticated central government with provincial administrators. They had their own currency. They had trade networks stretching across Central Africa. They had metal workers, textile artists, and agricultural systems that fed millions. They had cities, courts, and a royal dynasty that governed with complex bureaucratic systems. And here's where it gets really interesting. In 1491, when Portuguese explorers first made contact with Congo, the Congolese king, Nzinga Nkuwu, made a choice that would change everything. He converted to Christianity. But understand this clearly. This wasn't forced conversion. This wasn't conquest. The Portuguese at this point didn't have the military power to force anything. King Nzinga Nkuwu chose Christianity because he saw potential benefits in aligning with European powers. He was baptized, took the name João, and his son, who would become King Afonso I, was educated by Portuguese priests and became fluent in Portuguese. This created something unprecedented, an African Christian kingdom that could communicate directly with European courts in their own languages, using their own religious and diplomatic frameworks. King Afonso I didn't just write letters to the King of Portugal. He wrote as one monarch to another, as one Christian king to another, expecting to be treated with the respect due to a fellow sovereign. And for a brief moment, that's exactly what happened. There was genuine diplomatic exchange. There were trade agreements. There was mutual recognition. But there was a problem. A massive, horrifically profitable problem. Portuguese traders in the region had discovered something far more lucrative than ivory or copper. Human beings. By the early 1500s, the Portuguese slave trade was exploding, and Congolese citizens were being kidnapped, chained, and shipped across the Atlantic. And King Afonso I was watching his kingdom being hollowed out from within. In 1526, he wrote a letter to King João III of Portugal that should be in every history textbook, but isn't. He wrote, "We cannot estimate how great the damage is, since the mentioned merchants are taking every day our natives, sons of the land and the sons of our noblemen and vassals and our relatives." Read that again. An African king writing in Portuguese to a European king, begging him to stop his merchants from kidnapping African citizens. This wasn't a primitive chief pleading with colonial masters. This was one monarch demanding another honor their diplomatic agreements. Portugal's response? They increased the slave trade. Because here's the ugly truth. The Portuguese crown was making too much money. Every diplomatic letter from Afonso was an inconvenience, a moral complication in a system that required Africans to be considered less than human. So they filed his letters away and kept shipping people. But King Afonso and his successors weren't giving up. If letters weren't working, they'd try something bolder. They'd send ambassadors directly to Europe, not just to Portugal, but to the Pope himself, to the courts of Spain, to the Netherlands. They'd make Europe look African diplomats in the eye and acknowledge what they were doing. Understand how audacious this was. We're talking about a multi-month journey across one of the most dangerous oceans on the planet, in ships that frequently sank. These ambassadors knew there was a real chance they'd die before reaching Europe. And even if they survived the journey, they'd be walking into courts surrounded by the very people profiting from enslaving their countrymen. They'd be outnumbered, in hostile territory, trying to negotiate with empires that had every reason to pretend they didn't exist. And they did it anyway. Dom Antonio Manuel was one of them. Chosen by King Álvaro II, Antonio spent years preparing for his mission. He learned Portuguese and Latin. He studied European court protocols. He was equipped with gifts befitting one sovereign to another. Intricate ivory carvings, rich textiles, diplomatic letters sealed with the royal seal of Congo. His mission was clear: reach Pope Paul V and convince him to use his moral authority to condemn the Portuguese slave trade. In 1604, he began his journey. The voyage nearly killed him. Many diplomatic missions never made it. Ships sank. Ambassadors died of disease. Some deaths seemed suspiciously convenient for Portuguese interests. But Antonio Manuel survived. When he finally entered Rome in 1608, it created a sensation. Here was a black African man who didn't fit any of the categories Europe had created. He wasn't a slave in chains. He wasn't a curiosity to be gawked at. He processed through Rome with the full dignity of a diplomatic envoy, dressed in the finest robes, carrying credentials from a Christian king. European crowds didn't know what to make of him. This wasn't supposed to be possible. The Portuguese officials in Rome tried desperately to downplay his significance, to suggest he wasn't really a proper ambassador, that Congo wasn't really a proper kingdom. But Antonio Manuel had the credentials. He had the diplomatic paperwork. He had the royal authority. And Pope Paul V received him. Not as a novelty, not as a charitable case, but as what he was, an ambassador from a fellow Christian kingdom. They met, they spoke. Antonio Manuel presented his king's case against the slave trade. And the Pope listened. For one brief, shining moment, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, this could work. Maybe the moral weight of the papacy could bend the trajectory of history. But Antonio Manuel never made it home. He died in Rome in 1608, officially of illness. His mission accomplished something. The Pope did issue statements condemning certain aspects of the slave trade. But words from Rome couldn't compete with gold from Africa. The trade continued. But the ambassadors kept coming. Dom Miguel de Castro in 1643, sent by King Garcia II, traveled to the Netherlands and Brazil. We know exactly what he looked like because Dutch artists painted him. And these weren't caricatures or crude sketches. These were formal portraits showing a dignified black man in aristocratic dress, painted with the same respect Dutch artists gave to their own nobility. Those paintings still exist in museums today, physical proof that Europe knew exactly who these men were. Dom Miguel negotiated trade agreements, met with Dutch officials, and conducted himself with such diplomatic skill that it left contemporary observers writing admiringly about him. Yet somehow, this history got buried. Here's what we know from the records that survived. Between 1485 and 1670, there were over 40 documented diplomatic missions from the Kingdom of Congo to various European powers. 40. Multiple Congolese nobles lived in Europe for extended periods, some studying at universities, some serving in diplomatic residences. The Vatican archives contain thousands of pages of correspondence between Congolese kings and European powers. Portuguese royal archives have entire sections dedicated to Congolese diplomatic relations. European artists painted these ambassadors. European chroniclers wrote about them. This wasn't hidden at the time. It was known. So what happened? How did 2 centuries of diplomatic contact between a sophisticated African kingdom and European powers just vanish from history? The answer is as calculated as it is disturbing. By the late 1600s, the slave trade had become one of the most profitable enterprises in human history. The entire economic system of colonial expansion depended on it. And that system required a specific narrative: that Africans were primitive, that Africa had no civilization, that enslaving Africans was somehow doing them a favor by bringing them into contact with Christian civilization. The existence of the Kingdom of Congo and its diplomatic corps completely destroyed that narrative. You can't claim Africans are incapable of civilization while filing away letters written in perfect Portuguese from African kings. You can't claim Africa has no history, while your own archives contain 200 years of diplomatic correspondence. You can't call Africans savages while hanging portraits of African ambassadors in your palaces. The cognitive dissonance was too much, so European powers, particularly Portugal, made a choice. They chose profit over truth. They chose the slave trade over diplomatic partnership. And they chose to let the history of Congolese ambassadors fade into obscurity. By the time Enlightenment philosophers in the 1700s were pontificating about Africa, they wrote as if the continent had never produced any civilization worth noting. Hegel claimed Africa had no history. Hume suggested Africans were naturally inferior. These men had access to libraries and archives. They could have read the letters from King Afonso I. They could have seen the paintings of Dom Miguel de Castro. But acknowledging that evidence would have complicated the philosophical justifications for slavery and colonialism. So they didn't. They simply wrote as if those 2 centuries of diplomatic contact never happened. And here's the part that should make your blood boil. In the 1800s, when European explorers pushed deeper into Africa and discovered sophisticated kingdoms and cities, they acted shocked. They wrote breathless accounts of finding African civilizations as if it was impossible, as if it contradicted everything known about Africa. But their own governments had been receiving African ambassadors for centuries. Their own archives proved they'd known all along. The discovery narrative was pure theater, a performance designed to justify the colonization already underway. They pretended to be surprised by what their ancestors had known and deliberately forgotten. The Kingdom of Congo eventually collapsed, not from internal weakness, but from the external pressure of continuous slave raiding and Portuguese territorial ambitions. By the 1800s, the kingdom that had sent ambassadors to the Pope was broken. And when Europeans wrote its history, they wrote it as if it had always been a primitive territory waiting to be civilized, rather than a sophisticated state that had conducted diplomacy with European powers as equals. The ambassadors, the letters, the paintings, the entire diplomatic history was filed away in archives where it gathered dust for centuries. But here's what couldn't be erased: the evidence. Those paintings in Dutch museums, those thousands of pages in the Vatican archives, those letters in Portuguese royal collections. The physical proof survived even when the story was suppressed. And now, slowly, historians are bringing it back to light. They're going through those archives, translating those letters, analyzing those paintings, and reconstructing a history that powerful people wanted forgotten. Think about what this means. When those Congolese ambassadors walked into European courts, they weren't just conducting diplomacy. They were living proof that the entire moral justification for the slave trade was built on lies. Every time a European monarch shook hands with a Congolese diplomat, every time a pope received a Congolese ambassador, every time a European artist painted a black African ambassador with dignity and respect, it was evidence that Europeans knew. They knew Africans were capable of sophisticated governance. They knew Africa had kingdoms and cultures and diplomacy. They knew, and they did it anyway. They chose the profits of slavery over the truth of African humanity. The Congolese ambassadors ultimately failed in their primary mission. The slave trade didn't stop. If anything, it accelerated through the 1600s and 1700s. Millions of people were ripped from Africa and subjected to the nightmare of slavery. The diplomatic efforts of the Kingdom of Congo couldn't overcome the sheer economic weight of the Atlantic slave trade. In that sense, their mission failed. But their existence proved something that terrified European powers: that the justifications for slavery were lies, that Africans were every bit as human and sophisticated as Europeans, and that the entire colonial project was built on deliberate historical amnesia. This is why their story matters now. We're often taught history as if European colonization and slavery happened because Europeans didn't know any better, because they genuinely believed in racial hierarchies based on ignorance. But the story of the Congolese ambassadors proves that's not true. They knew. They met African diplomats. They read African kings' letters. They negotiated with African states as equals. And then they chose to forget, chose to erase, chose to pretend it never happened, because acknowledging it would have cost them too much money and power. So the next time someone suggests that Africa had no history before European contact, remember Dom Antonio Manuel processing through Rome in silk and gold. Remember King Afonso I writing in Portuguese to demand justice for his kidnapped citizens. Remember Dom Miguel de Castro sitting for Dutch portrait painters. Remember the 40 documented diplomatic missions and the thousands of pages of correspondence. Remember that for 200 years, Europe knew exactly what African civilization was capable of, and they chose to bury that knowledge under the weight of the slave trade. These ambassadors wore the finest diplomatic robes, spoke multiple languages, and negotiated in the halls of power. They proved their worth, their humanity, their sophistication over and over again. And history thanked them by erasing their names from textbooks and pretending they never existed. But we know now. The archives are open. The paintings remain. The letters survived. And the story of the black ambassadors who shocked Europe can finally be told. Not as a footnote, not as a curiosity, but as what it really was. Evidence of one of history's greatest cover-ups. Proof that the story we were told about Africa and Europe was always incomplete. And a reminder that truth has a way of surviving even when empires try to bury it. They walked into those courts knowing they might die. They spoke truth to power, knowing it might not matter. They represented their kingdom with dignity, knowing Europe was destroying it. And for 300 years, the world forgot their names. But not anymore. We remember. And in remembering them, we reclaim a piece of history that changes everything we thought we knew about Africa, Europe, and the lies that shaped the modern world.